Just a little bit ago, I finished filming a video responding to critics of the Hands Off 2025 event, saying that it was pointless and it was just a feel-good event and it didn't do anything. And then a friend sent me an article from Slate from April 7th that just absolutely perfectly dovetails with my last video. The title of the article is called "The Real Power of This Weekend's Anti-Trump Protests." The point of mass protest is not to stage a perfectly organized, fully realized one-time event. There we go. That is everything that I tried to say in my last video summed up in one sentence. The article again in Slate from April 7th by Jill Filipovich. I'm going to share a little bit of the article here, but please go read the whole thing. This is everything that the organizers were trying to communicate, that the 5.2 million participants understood. This is the beginning of the resistance. None of us who helped organize events or who participated ever believed that this was a one-off deal and we were going to stop fascism in 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon. And when I see people making that claim that April 5th did nothing because it didn't stop fascism, or that it wasn't effective, because those people don't understand what the ask, what the demands of the event were, and what the next steps are. I know that they're really speaking out of their ignorance and they don't really understand how nonviolent resistance works, how movements build toward a goal, how, again, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And so I really think this is an opportunity for folks who just want to lob criticism at what happened on April 5th. This is an opportunity for them to learn. Just because you make a critique, that doesn't make it valid. And in this case, the criticisms that I have seen are either coming from people who have a vested interest in discouraging people from claiming their power, from defending democracy, or they are people who really don't understand what the movement is doing. And here's a great opportunity to learn. On Monday, Americans woke to plunging markets, gutted retirement accounts, and the prospect that their clothes, electronics, and groceries are about to get a whole lot more expensive. Immigrants in the U.S., including legal ones, are living in fear of aggressive immigration and customs enforcement roundups, heinous administrative sloppiness, students being nabbed off the streets, and the consigning of innocent people to Salvadoran prison. In Texas, a second unvaccinated child, I would phrase that as a child who is denied access to appropriate medical care by her parents. That child has died of measles, a preventable disease once thought to be eradicated from the United States. And Donald Trump is musing about an unconstitutional and illegal third term. It's not a sunny morning in America, but something else happened over the weekend that is a little ring of light peeking around the dark clouds emanating from the White House. Americans took to the streets by the tens of thousands. Again, the media is massively underreporting. 5.2 million people. That's the official count. There were tens of thousands of people just in downtown Portland. There were at least 500,000 in Washington, D.C. More than 1,200 demonstrations were held nationwide, and the total count is about 1,400 because there were also solidarity events in Canada and across Europe. Those demonstrations were held to say, hands off the government, hands off our rights, hands off our freedoms. The protests were against shadow President Elon Musk as much as they were against President Donald Trump. And while the protests didn't get as much coverage as they deserved, they were actively suppressed by legacy media, by media that is afraid of pissing off Donald Trump. And when they were covered, what happened at them and the turnout was massively minimized. Again, because they are all pandering to Trump and they don't want to draw his ire. And while these protests are not going to change the nation overnight, they were nevertheless phenomenally successful. We should take heart. And even if nothing changes right away, and nothing will change right away, we must get out and do it again and again. In a previous video, I was responding to somebody who went to the April 5th protests, and she said, I am ready to be in the streets every Saturday for the next 4 years. This is what I want folks poo-pooing the hands-off event to understand. The point is not an immediate result from the White House on down. It's to galvanize from the ground up, to put pressure on the powerful and to forge a pathway for the public to collectively say no to this devastating regime. The article then goes on to say that the protests weren't perfect. Anecdotally, they felt that the protests were very white, and I have explained in other videos why that is. And again, anecdotally, the author felt that the events were disproportionately female, which is increasingly representative of Democrats, if not American power structures. I am going to say I think it's weird that the author characterized the largest demographic of protesters as middle-aged wine moms. the much maligned demographic of college-educated, suburban-dwelling denizens of PTAs and community carpools. That's not what I witnessed at either of the Portland events that I attended. The group with the largest representation at both of the two protests I went to was boomers. Slightly more men than women. At the large Portland event, there were also a heck ton of millennials, and there were a lot of Gen Z. And of course, as forgotten, Gen X, Zennials as well. Okay, but let's roll with the author's anecdotal claim that the protests were mostly white, middle-aged wine moms. She says, this means that the protesters won't get as much coverage as Keffiyeh-wearing college kids. But these women with long track records of getting things done, okay, that's fair. They got things done the first time around. She means the organizing during the first Trump administration that saved the Affordable Care Act and helped mitigate a lot of the harm that Trump wanted to do then. For all the dismissals of the resistance, the protests against Trump's first overreach did have an effect. They constrained the administration and forced Democrats and moderate Republicans to act. I really don't like her referring to us as wine moms. I think that's weird to pick that term, but okay. The resistance wine moms organized their families, their friends, and their communities. They showed up, and they often show up for other people. The fact that the protests were so white is clearly a bad thing for democratic organizing. Again, I don't think that's true. I have heard many Black creators explain exactly why they stayed home, and it wasn't because of the protests themselves. It was because of the violence of our police state, and because it is time for white people to build back trust with the Black community, to show that we are willing to put our money where our mouth is. We are willing to get on the front lines. We are willing to defend everybody. We also know that a lot of immigrants were really concerned about showing up because they were afraid of ICE. ICE is not going to come after me. And we already know that ICE has detained illegally American citizens as well as green card holders, and has erroneously arrested and also renditioned innocent people to the gulag in El Salvador. So a lot of folks that were concerned that ICE might use any excuse to snatch them up also stayed home, and that's totally understandable. It doesn't mean that they're not defending democracy. It doesn't mean that they're not resisting in other ways, right? I also heard a number of Black creators who were like, we are resisting in all kinds of other ways, just because we didn't show up to the march on April 5th for a whole host of legitimate reasons that we don't have to explain to you. That doesn't mean that we're not resisting. I want to be sure that people are not conflating folks not showing up on April 5th with folks are not willing to engage in the defense of democracy and protection of their communities, because that's not what's happening. The author goes on to talk about this a little bit. Virtually none of the people being snatched off the streets or handcuffed in immigration raids are middle-aged white women. That doesn't mean middle-aged white women are safe. The rights of women to determine our own reproductive lives have been decimated in conservative states and are at risk in liberal ones. Our children live under threat and under an authoritarian regime. Nobody's safety is guaranteed right now. But in this moment, college-educated white citizens are amongst the most secure. So of course, we should be the ones on the front line. We have the most protection, the most privilege. The author says, under normal circumstances, you might think that a resistance movement should have a representative sample of the population that it is trying to defend, to protect, to advocate for. But given the current circumstances in America, how high the stakes are, the unequal distribution of risk, it makes sense that April 5th was very white. This is the best we can probably do in this particular moment and what we must do to protect vulnerable populations. The point of mass protest is not to stage a perfectly organized, fully realized one-time event. The point is to boost collective morale, to allow for a mass expression of rage, and to galvanize the public, to propel people out of their post-election exhaustion and malaise, and remind them that we can and we must fight back. Skipping down again, the protests will not change this administration overnight. But that's not the point, y'all. Pressure is the point. Changing the social climate is the point. Creating a sense of social obligation to resist tyranny is the point. Trump's agenda is a radically unpopular one, rivaled only by its own implementation. At their best, protests give voice to those fighting the powerful and nefarious. And in this case, the anti-Trump protests gave voice to a majority that had previously been cowed and stunned into silence. Whatever dam of despair that kept so many Americans quiet and despondent has now broken. People flooded the streets with a popular and reasonable demand: stop destroying the country. Trump is unlikely to listen, but the many powerful people who have folded or stayed silent or supported him, they might. Trump stands in the Oval Office only because so many people are propping him up. The weekend's protests were the first big strikes at that scaffolding. The power of the people is greater than the people in power, and we're just getting going.